Here's something they never told you in church. The God of the Bible didn't abandon Israel. Israel hid from him. Not metaphorically, not symbolically. They built altars right next to his temple to three specific gods. Three names carved in stone. Three systems of worship so powerful, so deeply embedded in their culture, that even the most devoted kings couldn't fully root them out. Baal, Molech, Asherah. These weren't obscure myths. These were the gods Israel chose. Repeatedly, deliberately. And the consequences were catastrophic. But here's the question nobody asks. Why? Why would a people who had witnessed the parting of the Red Sea, manna falling from heaven, walls crumbling at the sound of a trumpet, why would they abandon all of that to bow before carved wood and heated iron? In the next 20 minutes, you're going to understand something that changes the entire way you read the Old Testament. And more than that, you're going to recognize these same three systems operating today, disguised under different names. But first, I need to show you something that most Bible scholars won't touch. This question, why Israel kept turning away, is exactly the kind of thing that pushed me to start digging deeper, beyond what mainstream theology is willing to say. It's the same reason this channel, Awakened Minds, exists, because the surface answer is never enough. The surface answer you've probably heard goes something like this. Israel was weak. They were rebellious. They had a sin problem. And that's not wrong. But it's dangerously incomplete. Here's what they leave out. These three gods, Baal, Molech, and Asherah, weren't random temptations. They were engineered systems. Each one targeted a specific deep need inside the human soul. Power, security, pleasure. They weren't competing with Yahweh on spiritual terms. They were competing on psychological and economic terms. Baal worship began spreading into Canaan approximately 1,400 years before Christ. Baal was the storm god, the fertility god, the god of rain. And in an agricultural society where one bad harvest could mean starvation for your entire family, a god who claimed to control the rain wasn't just attractive. He was necessary, or so they believed. The priests of Baal built entire economic systems around this worship. You wanted your fields to produce. You paid. You brought your offering. You participated in the ritual sexual acts at the high places. Acts the priests told you were sacred. Acts that the Canaanite culture had normalized over generations. And here's the disturbing part. It worked. Not because Baal was real, but because ritual creates habit. Habit creates community. Community creates identity. And identity is the hardest thing to break. Dai in diante, excuse me, let me say that clearly. From that point forward, the cycle became self-reinforcing. Priests reinforced the teaching. Kings who allied with Phoenicia brought it into the courts. Intermarriage spread it into families. And nobody questioned it. Why? Because when an entire culture practices something together, it stops feeling like a choice and starts feeling like reality. But Baal is only the beginning. Asherah is where it gets even more personal. And Molech. Molech is where it becomes impossible to look away. So if this seemingly spiritual problem was actually a systemic one, what exactly were the mechanics? What made these three gods so effective at pulling an entire nation away from the one they had personally witnessed work miracles? There's a concept that ancient Gnostic scholars and modern psychologists have both identified from completely different directions. And it goes like this. Human beings don't abandon truth because they stop believing it's true. They abandon truth because something else promises to meet their needs faster. The Essenes had a term for this. They called it the three chains of Belial. 3 specific traps that they identified as the primary ways spiritual corruptions entered the soul of a community: fornication, riches, pollution of the temple. Today, researchers in behavioral psychology call a similar pattern competitive moral disengagement. When a belief system stops delivering felt results, the human mind seeks replacement systems, not randomly, but according to deep internal needs. I call it the 3 replacement gods. The idea is simple. Baal, Molech, and Asherah were not 3 random idols. They were 3 precision instruments, each one designed to replace a specific relationship that Israel was supposed to have with Yahweh. Baal replaced trust in God's provision. Asherah replaced intimacy with God's presence. Molech replaced the covenant of God's protection with a transactional system of control. That makes sense, doesn't it? Think about it this way. If you believe the God you serve has gone silent, if the rains aren't coming, if the harvest is failing, if your enemies are at the border, and someone shows you a system that claims to deliver results right now, that's not stupidity. That's desperation meeting a predatory offer. And this is not something I'm inventing. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in 1947 in the caves at Qumran, contain explicit descriptions of how these 3 systems of worship functioned as coordinated corruptions. The Nag Hammadi texts, found in Egypt in the same decade, describe archonic systems of control that mirror these 3 functions almost exactly. The pattern of manufactured dependency appears across ancient cultures with remarkable consistency. The HeartMath Institute, in research published beginning in 1991, documented how chronic states of fear and powerlessness physically alter the human heart's electromagnetic field, weakening discernment and increasing susceptibility to authoritative external voices. In other words, when you're scared enough, desperate enough, and exhausted enough, you will follow whoever offers certainty, even if that certainty leads you away from everything you know to be true. And I'm going to prove it. With history, with the biblical text itself, with the testimony of people who survived these systems, and with a pattern you'll immediately recognize from your own life, starting with something that will stop you cold. Let's start with the historical evidence. In the ancient city of Ugarit, on the northern coast of what is now Syria, archaeologists in 1929 unearthed a library of cuneiform tablets dating to approximately 1400 BC. These tablets contain the complete mythology of Baal. They describe him as the ruler of clouds and storms, locked in eternal conflict with Mot, the god of death. What's astonishing is the detail. The Baal cycle, as scholars call it, describes ritualistic practices that align almost perfectly with what the prophets Elijah, Hosea, and Jeremiah were condemning in Israel hundreds of years later. The same high places, the same ritual prostitution, the same agricultural sacrifices. Civilizations that had direct contact with Israel were running the identical system. That's not coincidence. That's infrastructure. But ancient tablets are easy to dismiss. So let me show you what the Bible text itself says, because most people have never actually read these passages slowly. In 1 Kings 18:19, Elijah confronts 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah, 850 professional religious practitioners, all of them operating under the patronage of Queen Jezebel, in the same palace that housed the ark. At the same time that Yahweh was supposedly Israel's God, 850 professional cult priests, paid, housed, protected by the crown. You know what that tells me? This wasn't a fringe movement. This was state religion. And Yahweh worship had been reduced to something people practiced quietly, alone, underground. Elijah himself says in verse 22, "I am the only one left." He believed himself to be the last one standing. Second awakened minds mention, integrated. I spent weeks going through these passages for awakened minds, cross-referencing the Hebrew text with the archaeological record, And what I found was that the word translated as hidden in several key passages actually comes from the root word meaning to conceal for protection. Israel didn't abandon God. They hid him, like something precious that the culture had made dangerous to display. Now, here's where Molech becomes impossible to look away from. The worship of Molech is described in Leviticus 18:21, 2 Kings 23:10, and Jeremiah 32:35. The ritual involved passing children through fire, sometimes described as literal burning sacrifice, in the valley of Ben Hinnom, just outside Jerusalem. The Hebrew name for this valley, Gehenna, the same word Jesus would later use for hell. This was happening outside Jerusalem, practiced by Israelites. A 2012 archaeological study published in the journal Near Eastern Archaeology examined infant remains found at Carthaginian Tophet sites, sacred precincts associated with Molech-related worship, and confirmed intentional sacrifice in a significant percentage of cases. The system was real. The deaths were real. And here's the question that never gets asked in polite Bible study. How do parents who love their children come to believe that sacrificing them is the right thing to do? The answer is catastrophically relevant today. The priests of Molech had a theological framework. They taught that this god demanded the most precious thing you had, your firstborn, in exchange for security and prosperity for everything else. It was transactional religion at its most brutal. But here's the key. It didn't start with burning children. It started with small compromises, a small offering, then a larger one. Then the community normalized it. Then the priests declared it sacred. Then kings encoded it. Then it became law. Step by step. Increment by increment. Until a parent stood at the fire believing they were doing the right thing. And now think. Think carefully. What modern systems ask you to sacrifice your most precious things? Your time, your children's formation, your values, in exchange for promises of security and acceptance. That's not rhetorical. That's the mechanism, and it hasn't changed. Stop and look at what we've assembled here. Ancient archaeology confirms these were organized state-sponsored systems. The biblical text shows they operated simultaneously with, not instead of, official Yahweh worship. Documented historical records show these same patterns repeated across multiple unconnected civilizations, and psychological research confirms the exact neurological conditions these systems exploited, all pointing the same direction. So why isn't this taught? Why do most sermons stop at, "They sinned and God punished them"? The answer isn't pretty. To understand why this is hidden, you have to follow the institutional logic. Who benefits from you believing that Israel's idolatry was simply disobedience and sin, a moral failing, rather than a sophisticated system of psychological and economic capture? The institutional church benefits. Because if the fall of Israel was caused by engineered replacement systems, systems that targeted specific needs and manufactured dependency, then you immediately ask, are there any such systems operating inside the modern church? And that question is dangerous to institutions that depend on your financial participation, your emotional loyalty, and your deference to their interpretation of Scripture. The religious publishing industry generates over $1.8 billion annually in the United States alone. The prosperity gospel sector, which functions structurally almost identically to Baal worship, promising material blessing in exchange for ritual financial offerings, represents billions more. I'm not saying every church is corrupt. I want to be precise here. I am saying that the mechanisms, manufactured dependency, authoritative mediation, ritual participation required for promised blessing, these mechanisms are identical in structure to what the prophets condemned. And how is this kept from view? 3 ways. First, the academic theological establishment controls the language. When scholars translate these texts, they make interpretive choices that soften the systemic nature of the problem. High places sounds poetic. Ritual prostitution is often translated as cult practices, sanitized, abstract, distant. Second, the narrative is kept personal. Israel sinned. You sin. Therefore, the lesson is personal repentance. The systemic analysis, who built these systems, who profited from them, how they captured entire nations, is never the sermon. Because systemic analysis leads to uncomfortable questions about present institutions. Third, Asherah is almost never discussed, and Asherah is the most personal one, because Asherah targeted something the other two didn't. I know this is uncomfortable. I sat with it for a long time before I could talk about it clearly. But the anger isn't useful unless you know what to do with it. And now you do. Let me show you exactly how to apply this. Enough context. Here are 3 concrete things you can do, starting today, to identify and disconnect from modern replacement God systems. No money required, no special materials, just attention and honesty. Step 1. Audit your dependency systems. Sit down, seriously, this is worth 10 minutes, and ask yourself, what do I depend on for security that isn't God? Write it down. Don't spiritualize it. Be brutally honest. Financial security, a relationship, a political figure, a medical system, an institution. This is the Baal test. Because Baal's entire function was to position himself as the necessary mediator between you and the basic things you needed to survive. Whatever sits in that position in your life, whatever you believe you cannot function without, is worth examining. This doesn't mean those things are evil. Rain is still rain. Provision is still provision. The question is, where does your trust actually live? Step 2. Identify the intimacy replacement. This is Asherah's territory, and it's the one most people miss entirely. Asherah was the mother goddess, the goddess of comfort, of sensory pleasure, of emotional warmth. Her worship was designed to feel like relationship, but it was relationship without accountability, without covenant, without the difficult reciprocity that real intimacy demands. Here's the modern application. What gives you the feeling of intimacy without requiring real vulnerability? What do you consume? Media, content, substances, entertainment that produces the emotional warmth of connection without the risk of actual relationship. Most people have an Asherah. Most of us have several. The question isn't condemnation. The question is recognition, because you can't replace something you haven't named. Step 3. And this one is for the person who is ready to go deeper. Examine what you've sacrificed and ask whether it was required. The Molech system operated on a lie, that the most catastrophic sacrifice was the most holy one, that God required you to destroy your most precious things in exchange for security. Let me say this carefully. God does call us to surrender what we love most. But the difference between Yahweh's call and Molech's demand is this. Yahweh's call produces life. Molech's demand produces ash. If you have given up something precious, a relationship, your time with your children, your own formation, your health, in the name of religious duty, institutional loyalty, or the promise of future blessing, it is worth asking honestly, who was that sacrifice for? And what did it actually produce? Now, 2 things to avoid. The first mistake is making this purely intellectual. You can understand all 3 systems, name them correctly, quote the archaeology, and still serve them. Because these systems don't live in the mind. They live in the gut, in the reflex, in what you reach for when you're afraid at 2 in the morning and the silence feels too loud. The second mistake is swinging into isolation. The answer to a false community is not no community, The answer to manufactured intimacy is not isolation. The answer to a system that exploited your needs is not to pretend you have no needs. Here's what to expect. In the first week of this kind of honest examination, discomfort. Real discomfort. Because you'll start seeing things you've been successfully not seeing. After a month of consistent practice, clarity. Specifically, a growing ability to distinguish between offers that require your dependency and invitations that strengthen your own capacity. With time, something the Psalms call confidence of faith, a settled, unperformed certainty that doesn't need external systems to validate it. That's not mysticism. That's what happens when you stop feeding systems that were built to keep you hungry. Let's bring it together. You came in thinking this was a history lesson about ancient idolatry. Here's what you actually discovered. Israel didn't simply abandon God out of weakness. They were captured by 3 precision systems: Baal targeting their need for provision, Asherah targeting their need for intimacy, and Molech targeting their need for security. Systems so well constructed that even the most dedicated kings couldn't fully dismantle them. And the theological establishment has kept the analysis systemic, because systemic analysis is dangerous to institutions. You saw the archaeological evidence, the biblical text read closely, the psychological mechanics confirmed by modern research, and the pattern still operating, still recognizable, still targeting the same 3 needs, running through contemporary culture. You are not the same person who pressed play. You now belong to a smaller group of people who read the text not as a story about other people's failures, but as a manual for recognizing the systems that target you. And the question is, what are you going to do with that? Here's the truth. Baal, Molech, and Asherah are not names buried in the past. They are functions, and functions don't die. They find new containers. The next video goes deeper into something that connects directly to this: the specific biblical prayers that the prophets used to break these systems, not just personally, but for entire communities. Because Elijah didn't stop at the diagnosis. He stood on a mountain, soaking the altar in water, and called down fire. That's the next step. If this video reached something real in you, not just intellectually, but somewhere deeper, share it with one person. Not for the algorithm, because this kind of information needs a human hand to pass it. That's how it always traveled. You don't have a religion problem, you have a recognition problem. And today, that changed. See you in the next one.